Hi, I'm Bill Crystal. Welcome to Conversations. I'm very pleased to have with me again Harvey Mansfield, professor of philosophy at political philosophy at Harvard University and I guess political science, government department, but the political philosophy subsection of government, and a leading interpreter, translator, student of Machiavelli. And you're going to explain Machiavelli and modernity today.
All right, I'll start.
Machiavelli and modernity for dummies. You can assess. Do you want to?
Was Machiavelli the founder of modernity?
Yeah, that's my question. I learned that from you, and I repeated it in my few years of. I dutifully repeated it in my few years of teaching, but I can't say I ever really understood it. So
well, let's attack the meaning of those words. So first, Machiavelli doesn't speak of himself as a founder, and he doesn't seem to use that word very much. I think if you wanted to know what he thought of himself he was a prince. A strange kind of prince, a thinker or a writer who's a prince, but that isn't announced. And then modernity. So for him, he lived in modernity already. Modernity was especially Christian modernity. So it was the ancients who have been corrupted into decadent Christianity which is both weak and cruel. It saps your sense of honor in this world, and makes you think always of the other world. And but then it can sometimes make you go on crusades to save other people's souls, and that makes it cruel. So so modernity for him is something bad. Originally, and it's only as you see what he does with the term and with his own thought that modernity turns out to be something good and new. There are the ancients, and then there are the moderns. And Machiavelli says the ancients are strong and the moderns are weak. But that gets turned around because it turned out that the ancients were defeated by the moderns, that the pagan world was overthrown by the Christian world. How did the ancients get defeated by someone who was weaker? So that's you could say, the first puzzle that he offers. And his answer is that the moderns, or the Christians, are stronger than they seem, and that their religion, which seems to make you both weak and cruel, can actually be reinterpreted to do the opposite and to make you strong and free. So now, how did he do this? And you can look at, I think, say 3 areas: politics and morality and philosophy. So let's start with politics and morality. What did he want to change in order to make us better, more effective, and more modern? Well, the best text to start from, I think, is the first paragraph in the 15th chapter of The Prince, in which Machiavelli says that he departs from the orders of others. And how does he depart? He says that others have asked you to behave as you ought to behave, and he says you must take as your standard how men actually behave. So you must go from the ought to the is, or what exists. And that's usually known as realism.
Right.
And so Machiavelli, you could say, begins realism as a feature of both politics and morality. But there's a characteristic of realism, which is that he doesn't think that it's realistic to give up on politics or to give up on morality. The criticisms that he makes of the previous politics and morality, he says that they're all based on imagination. They're not based on an understanding of the effectual truth, that is, the way things actually proceed as opposed to the way you would wish or would like them to proceed. So you must take as your standard then what will make you succeed realistically, and that standard, the word that he uses, is necessity. So It's kind of a paradox. You'll make yourself more free and more strong if you behave as if you were a pawn, you could say, of necessity. So that's realism, or is it? Because underneath Machiavelli's realism and modern realism generally is idealism. In other words, a realism that has the other side of which is the opposite, idealism. It's a realism which thinks that by being realistic, you will make your life much better than otherwise it could have been.
Because surely before Machiavelli, there were hard-headed, realistic observers of politics who knew that life didn't go according to, politics wasn't always conducted according to moral dictates and idealistic cities and so forth.
You could say that all the ancients were aware of this. And some of them thought that the best thing to do was to go into imaginary best regimes and use that as your standard. And that's, generally speaking, the Socratic tradition of Plato and Aristotle. And Machiavelli refers to that as basing your hopes on imaginary republics and principalities. Imaginary republic like Plato's Republic, and imaginary principality like St. Augustine's City of God. So, underneath, but for him, underneath realism, or this sort of this pessimistic view of human possibilities, there is opportunity for great change for the better. If by being realistic, if you turn realistic, you can solve all the problems that the ancients had when it came to when though their basis was imaginary. So necessity replaces imagination. Now, how does this happen? Well, for both morality and politics, and especially morality, you can begin from his play called The Mandragola. That play is a comedy. It tells of a young man who falls in love with a beautiful woman who happens to be married to a professor of political science, or that's a slight exaggeration, a man named Messer Nietzsche. But the woman is very Christian and very chaste. She believes very much that she should keep her vows as a wife and not consort with young men who happen to fall in love with her. But she wants a child. She and her husband both want a child. Her husband wants him for political purposes. So the play proceeds in such a way that everybody gets what he wants. The young man gets to possess his love, and the couple gets to have a child. The reason they couldn't have a child, and one of them, and that's a bit of a comical part, namely the professor, Dr. Messer Nietzsche, is sterile. But of course he thinks that it's his wife who is the cause of it. So it's a complicated tale. But the result is that it's just this simple lesson. If you are brave enough to choose the way of adultery, you can have a child. So what they do is
he's not known to be
he's not
adulterous,
known to be
adulterous.
Yeah, so they have a complicated way of bringing this about. But the end of the play is a complete success because the couple gets the child, and as I say, the young man gets his prize. And so the lesson is, if you do evil, the result will be good. But if you do good, the result will be evil. So if you do good and be chaste and refuse to engage in adultery, you won't get that child. But if you're willing to let somebody else who's not sterile actually father the child, then the result will be good. So that I think is the general moral lesson of Machiavelli. If you can relax the absolute standards of morality, then you can make them succeed in what they're trying to do. And you see, the Bible says, be chaste, no adultery, but it also says, be fruitful and multiply. So the Bible really doesn't give you the means necessary to the end. If you really want to be fruitful and multiply, have a child, you have to be willing to relax your morality. And actually, you could say that in Aristotle, too, the same contradiction exists. He says man is a pairing animal by nature, but he also says by nature we like to be able to reproduce. So if you can reproduce only by deserting or abandoning, at least for the moment, your wife or your husband, then that's something you need to do, according to Machiavelli. So that's necessary. See how he presents necessity. It's the necessary means to a perfectly good end, or one lapse of nature or one lapse of morality will get you what morality wants. So that's a view of morality. And what it suggests then is that morality can't stand on its own the way it wants to. If you're a moral person, you're supposed to be moral because it's moral, and not because someone is watching you or praising you or going to reward you for your morality. But for Machiavelli, no, you have to look at the consequences. So you have to look at how you are held. In this chapter 15, he talks about what moral qualities might be. But he also talks about how you are held if you want to be moral. So if you're generous, say, and want to be held generous, you can't always be generous because it won't succeed. If you always try to give to someone who deserves something, that person will, after a while, consider it to be routine, and he won't be grateful to you anymore. So you have to be concerned with the reaction of the person, of another person, to your moral behavior. And that means that morality, speaking generally, is politicized. You always have to think of the situation that you're in when you're going to be moral, and how will people react to this. And they won't react to morality with morality. It's foolish to expect that if you do a good deed to someone, that person will do a good deed back to you. And that's because that person thinks that he deserves this good deed that you've given to him. He doesn't look on it as your generosity. He looks on it as his justice. So therefore should he do something good for you just because you've done something good for him? So that would be the way in which beneficiaries of benevolent deeds look on benevolence. And if you generalize this and try to apply to all the moral virtues, you see that you come up with his picture of what you must do, what it is prudent to do in terms of morality.
So why does that make him, there were people before him who were not devout believers in piety or morality, who understood that there were tensions between moral demands and either pleasure or political advancement and so forth, and there were troublemakers of all Boccaccio. Everyone ranging from ancients to people who lived quite just a century or two before Machiavelli or his contemporaries, who were critics of morality, you might say, in various ways, and advisors to princes who understood that you couldn't really be moral, even if it's better to look moral. So I guess, but the sort of the normal kind of cartoon version of Machiavelli is, this hard-headed debunker of morality and all that. But why so obviously the next step somehow is the founder of modernity. That's different somehow. The argument is that Machiavelli pushes that in a direction beyond debunking or hard-headedness or
yes,
cleverness
right,
or whatever.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you could say that he starts from the Machiavellians who have preceded him but haven't earned that name.
Right.
And the reason they haven't earned the name is that they didn't have a Machiavelli to justify them. So the people who justified them were like Aristotle and the Bible, that always putting before you the demands of morality as opposed to the advantages of it or the advantages of appearing it. So the people that came before Machiavelli and who did this always were inhibited by this the atmosphere, you could say, of morality, which had been imposed by the philosophers and by religion. It wasn't. Yes, it wasn't that the philosophers didn't realize too that you had to be careful of the way you looked if you tried to do something immoral, but that there were advantages to being immoral. Well, it wasn't that they didn't know that, but they thought that on the whole it was good and necessary to, and that goodness depended on a climate, you could say, or an atmosphere in which goodness is thought to be primary, and that your main business in life was to lead a good life, and not just to survive in a situation of scarcity.
And the amoralists and immoralists who preceded Machiavelli, of whom there were presumably an awful lot, both private and some who wrote Boccaccio. I don't know much about Boccaccio, but people like that, The difference is that Machiavelli believes that somehow it's not just a way to personally flourish in a climate where others are moral, but that somehow he can change. I mean, it will help human beings. I mean, his teaching. I mean, again, what makes him distinctive, and the founder of modernity part of it, I guess, is.
Yes. You could imagine that Mandragola story being told by Boccaccio.
Right.
But then the lesson that he would draw is how paradoxical our life is. On the one hand, we want to be good, and on the other hand, we refuse to take the measures that are necessary to succeed.
And some clever individual might see that and take care of his own
that's right.
life in that way.
Yeah. But to make this general and, so I could say, political is something quite new.
And the point of that,
now, Machiavelli didn't make a new morality that would be more realistic as a whole. So he was a little more subtle and complicated than that. Later on, sort of in the 17th century, you had a new morality of the rights of man, and the primary right of man is self-preservation. And that's really Machiavellian in origin, you can see. As he said back in this paragraph in The Prince that I mentioned, that you don't, if you follow the moral way or how people ought to behave, you learn your own ruin rather than your preservation. So Machiavelli too was in favor of preservation, but he thought that you couldn't really change morality for the people, for most people, that means. Most people are weak. Most people are aware that there are powers over them that they can't control. And so most people resort to make their lives more secure and more calm to religion. Because religion tells you that you will be taken care of by God if you follow the necessary commands of God. And so most people think that if you are treated unjustly, God will save you or will reward you and will punish the person who treats you unjustly in the next life. So most people look on this world as depending on the goodness of paradise and hell in the next life. And they call on the strength of religion to cover over the defects of their own weakness. And I think Machiavelli believed that this would never change. And this is a permanent feature of human existence. So morality will never go away. There will always be, if not Christianity, something similar that has the same effect. But at the same time, these are not all people. So there are princely types that you mentioned that have always existed, but now have a kind of new license to operate in their way, and also new techniques to use that Machiavelli gives them in his political science, and these are princes. And princes have prudence. Most people don't have prudence. Princes have prudence. So every society needs princes. You can't have a multitude without a head. And the head has to be a prince. And so these princes are taught by Machiavelli that it's perfectly okay to exempt themselves from the religion that you can really say manipulate in order to control the mass of the people. And this I think is what makes Machiavelli different from preceding philosophers who also may have thought that religion was necessary for the common people, but they didn't think that the prince could exempt himself from religion, or at least be seen to do so.
This is for the sake of the prince, or for the sake ultimately of, the project he launches for the sake of humankind?
It's for the sake of the prince, but especially, in order to keep his office, he must do what is necessary to keep it. But it's mainly for the sake of the people, actually.
Right.
It keeps them more secure to have a prince who can act sometimes against them, but mostly on their behalf. Because what princes mainly do is secure themselves against other princes.
Right.
And to do this, they need the help or the backing of the common people. So you get the typical picture of Machiavelli's politics, which is an alliance between the prince and the common people. And this, it's not an aristocracy. The typical picture of Aristotelian politics, let's say, is the rule of the aristocrats, or the better sort, more refined anyway, and nobles. But Machiavelli doesn't like gentlemen. He thinks that princes should attack gentlemen. And one of the best ways to get the common people on your side is to kill the gentlemen, because the common people have, maybe they don't always express it, but they have a kind of deep underlying hatred of their betters. The weak hate the strong. So you can, with a sensational execution now and again, that's one of Machiavelli's techniques, political techniques, you can impress the common people. Now, you wouldn't impress them unless you can really shock them. So Machiavelli retains a kind of sensationalism. He doesn't want life or political life to be without drama and excitement. Moral life is kind of boring. So morality needs immorality, if only to keep itself more interesting than it otherwise would be. So morality serves to make people capable of shock. Unless you can be impressed or be shocked, say you won't really believe what is necessary. Now, morality has a further characteristic that it wants always to be absolute. It never makes exceptions for necessity. But that's really impossible. So back to the Mandragola. It was really impossible for that couple, Messer Nietzsche and his wife, Lucrezia, to have a child, say, by themselves. So that once that necessity was accepted, then you see that it's, in order to accept it, you have to violate morality. So morality, on the one hand, is always alive and always insistent that that it be respected. It always wants to make an issue of itself. But on the other hand, it can never achieve what it wants, or it can't regularly do that. There always will arise some occasion in which you have to do some dirty deed in order to just keep yourself alive, and certainly in order to succeed. You can live a long life and think you're happy, yeah? But if you're not really willing to murder someone or to do him in some dirty way, then you're living a protected existence, which you're living on fortune instead of on your own virtue.
But all this, the liberation of the princes and the undercutting of morality, ultimately is not just, this is the way the world is, and if you want to flourish, this is what you have to do. It's ultimately part of a project, and when we say Machiavelli and the founder of modernity, that somehow, to get back to where we began, rectifies the problem of the weakening of human beings and under Christianity, or that strengthens human beings altogether. This is somehow for the common good, right? Not just it's not just advice to his most clever readers to have more individually satisfying, amoral lives.
No, this is a boon to mankind as a whole.
So why is that? I guess that seems to be the key to...
Not just for the thinkers and the philosophers or the big shots or the princes. Yeah.
And why? And so that's, in that respect, he's launching the kind of...
Yeah, he's launching a great operation. Launching. Say, maybe founding goes too far, but launching. He doesn't think that in his time this is going to happen. He does think that Christianity is corrupt, that the church is corrupt, and that there's a good chance that it won't last very much longer. And indeed, of course, in his time, really about almost the same year that he wrote The Prince, 1513, Martin Luther nails his theses to the church, and Protestantism, the Protestant Reformation, gets started. And that too was an attack on the corruption of Christianity or of the church as it was. So it would have to take some time for Machiavelli to influence or persuade, or in a certain sense corrupt, the philosophers who followed him, and who might make changes in his program, but still would carry out the general thrust of it and make it happen. So that might take a century or so, or as it did, and he couldn't make his project altogether open and announce it. He does say that he's bringing new modes and orders, and that he departs from the orders of others, and so it's there, and so anyone who reads can see that, but you have to think your way really to the really enormity of his ambition. He himself is very ambitious. He wants to do something that will affect in a positive way all mankind, and he calls that his enterprise, la mia impresa. And when impresa means enterprise, and now we have free enterprise, and so that becomes already a modern concept, a word. And so the way we are today, we moderns, I think is in good part due to the launching, let's call it, or founding of Machiavelli.
So the relief of man's estate that Francis Bacon pioneers, and the new political science of Hobbes, and all the things we associate with, in a more direct way, I would say, with modern politics and modern morality and modern life. That's the argument would be that Machiavelli lays the groundwork for that.
He lays the groundwork for that, and
And sort of anticipates it.
He anticipates it
more or less.
And the one thing I think he also anticipated was that his own name would be a name for doing evil, which is, of course, is what happened.
And he's willing to take that
He's willing
opprobrium.
He is,
despite his love of glory.
He's willing to take the opprobrium of most people if underneath it there isn't a certain secret admiration.
Some people like you come along and
yeah.
show how much credit he deserves ultimately.
Yes, that's right.
He was confident that would happen at some
that would
point.
happen at some time.
That's good.
You're right, that someone would be open-minded or to blurt out the truth about his project, as we now say, project or enterprise. Yeah, so, the fact that most people will use this term Machiavellian to mean something you mustn't do, that's part of the fact that morality is going to continue as it is. So therefore he's always going to have an ill repute. So that, and two, that's another way in which a successor of his might want to or be able to change the reputation of Machiavellianism. Now, his successors, the early modern philosophers owe a lot to him, but they they hardly ever mention him. The only one who does is Francis Bacon. He was the only one brave enough, you could say, or open enough to mention his debt to Machiavelli.
I suppose that illustrates Machiavelli's the correctness of his own thought, that, or his judgment, that to found something that would ultimately be beneficial to mankind, you would have to do or say things or teach things that would have to be decried by
That's right.
by conventional mankind.
So he would be revered as a kind of reverse founder,
right?
of everything evil, but the actual founder, to those who can penetrate his thinking, of everything good.
And so, just to finish on the political moral side of it, so the key, I don't know if there's one key, but a key, he needs to publicly do what people had previously perhaps thought, but not thought you could publicly.
That's right.
Should publicly articulate.
That's right.
Is that right?
That's it. Publicly do that, and the word that makes that possible is necessity. So it's necessary to do this or that, which previously was thought evil, but necessary only in difficult times and emergencies, or when things pinch you, circumstances force you. But no, it's necessary, and that means your principle is necessary. So it might not be necessary right now to be evil, but you have to anticipate that you might be in the future. So it's already, that means the necessity isn't present necessity, but it's anticipated necessity. And that's much expanded. And also, you have to anticipate, if you're anticipating, that most people won't agree with you, that they won't see this necessity. And that is their weakness. And their weakness is their necessity. So in a strange way, it's necessary for them to resist what is truly necessary. And so necessity must account for the fact that lots of people will resist you. Necessary to them, but they will resist what you see to be truly necessary, and therefore in their interest.
Just on this, so again, on this political moral side going forward, do you think Machiavelli would have thought that after he'd prepared the way that Hobbes and Locke and all of them would be able to gradually change public morality in a certain way, or would he have thought that at the end of the day, though, they can't really grasp, there would always have to be a certain kind of wishfulness or hopefulness? And I guess, well, maybe he would have thought Hobbes and Locke indulged that. I mean, I suppose they don't really expose the true necessity, even as they pretend to be more hard-headed, or are more hard-headed. They're more hard-headed, but not really truly hard-headed in their public presentation, I suppose. So.
Yes, because the right to self-preservation is now just understood as the right to life, and that, and more important than that somehow, is the right to pursue happiness, which means to live your life as you wish. So which is much more of a hope than would seem to be promised by the word necessity. I can live as I wish.
Right.
So how can that be true? So in that way, you might say liberalism, the liberalism of John Locke especially, is a kind of delusion.
Right.
It keeps you from thinking about what is necessary to you, but it also serves as a justification for doing the sort of things that Machiavelli might suggest in a difficult situation, or even in a non-difficult situation, looking ahead to a difficult situation.
So presumably this fantastic enterprise of Machiavelli's is based on a philosophic judgment that it's both possible, that human nature and nature itself makes it possible to achieve what he hopes to achieve, and also that it's a good idea to achieve that, I suppose, since one could have thought about these possibilities and decided this
and rejected them.
Right, so
Yeah.
what's the why?
Yes, so first you could say Machiavelli is the founder of modernity because he changed our politics and our ethics. And a lot of people, I think, would agree with that. But I think very few see that he had a great change in philosophy in mind. And so let me talk a little bit about what that was. Because Machiavelli's not studied in philosophy departments now. He ought to be. And let me suggest why. First is the question whether Machiavelli was a philosopher, because he doesn't seem to make the kinds of detailed and careful, logical arguments that philosophers make, above all the scholastic philosophers, Thomas Aquinas, and the way they used syllogisms and worked very carefully from one question to the next necessary question. He doesn't do that. So what does he do? He says, of the world, or of worldly things. He has a continuous experience of worldly things. He's done a lot of reading, and he's also done these worldly things. So he thinks that there's something called the world. And I believe that today that the way that word world is used owes very much to Machiavelli. Now, what is the world? At the time that he was writing, the world meant to Christians this world. That's what they said, in this world. Occasionally you hear that today, but not very often.
Right.
Instead, people speak of you have to live in the world. That means the world of necessity. So what he did was to move from this notion that this world is the world. This world was always contrasted with the next world, with heaven, where things are much better. And this has a kind of parallel in Plato's and Aristotle's philosophy, that in this world there are imperfections. Your perceptions are of imperfect things. And not every tree, for example, is a perfect tree. So when you see a tree, you imagine it, or you can imagine it, as if it were a perfect tree. And that would give you the definition of a tree. The definition of a tree is not visible. You can write it. You can put it in a book on botany, on trees, distinguished from bushes. And so what that means is that the perceptual world, the perceived world, the visible world, is always contrasted with the imagined world, which is thought to be intelligible. So the tree that you see, you don't fully understand until you think about it and imagine it as it could be, and the ways, and say, in which its different parts, branches and leaves and roots and so on, interact to make a whole. So that means you've understood what a tree is. It's an intelligible thing. And if you add up all these intelligible things, then you get nature as intelligible. Nature has genus and species, different kinds. In this way, you can see that nature is sort of ordered, and it also has a hierarchy. Some things are higher, Aristotle would say, and others are lower. Today, you would simply say complex and simple. But no, higher means capable of more things or better things. So man is a higher being than a dog. So that, in other words, the world is always supplemented by and understood by something which is more important than the world that you see, namely the intelligible world. Now, what Machiavelli did was to suggest that you can't do this. And he spoke of what he called the effectual truth. The effectual truth is what your profession amounts to. You can make a profession of good, say. You might say to someone close to you, "I love you." What is that? Well, the effectual truth of it is that I want something from you. And that, so you look at the sort of the low-down necessity which is behind the profession of something. And that's what the effectual truth is. So the effectual truth means that the truth is how it comes out, the effect of it. And the effect of something is the consequence of it, but it's also the way in which it shows itself, has an effect. So that double meaning of effectual. Now, effectual, I think, is it's not just the ancestor, it's closer than that. It's the parent, let's say, of the word fact. So the effectual truth could also be translated as the factual truth. The fact of a thing, the way we say that today, the fact of the matter is. Notice we say the fact of the matter. Because matter is more factual than spirit.
Right.
Yeah, that's what you're saying. So the fact of the matter, and when you say that, it's kind of an objection. You may wish something.
Right.
So fact is understood as opposed to wish. And that's why facts are sometimes called brute facts or stubborn facts. So all this, I think, was initiated by Machiavelli with this idea of the effectual truth. And it's interesting that when he speaks of the effectual truth in this first paragraph of the 15th chapter of The Prince, the same text that we've been talking about, he uses that phrase only this once in all of his writing. He never used it elsewhere in any other book or even a letter. Nor did any other Italian in the whole Renaissance use this phrase. So effectual truth seems to be a kind of Machiavellian invention. Mm-hmm. And the word effectual and effect turns up in the century after Machiavelli. So a fact is understood as something opposed to what an imagination is. See, imagination can be two things. It can be, and this is the way Plato and Aristotle understood it, the imagination of the truth of something that you see. So it's connected to nature. You imagine the tree as it is when it's perfect or complete. It may not be the way you see it, but the imagination is based on the way you see it. But for Machiavelli, it's not that way. You do imagine things. So he too has an imaginary republic or an imaginary principality. But it's free of what you see. It's free of the visible, the whole distinction between visible and intelligible. So what you see are facts. And facts, say, don't encourage you to look for the intelligible nature of a thing. The fact is already intelligible, which means it's not intelligible because you can't get around it. It's stubborn. It doesn't explain itself. So you just have to accept that. And once you accept that, however, then your imagination is free of having to see something in order to imagine it, if I can put it. So this new kind of reason comes out of Machiavelli, and that is the reason that conceives something that isn't the case. So Hobbes talks about
Modern science.
Yeah, Hobbes talks about the difference between prudence, which is based on what you see, and science, which is based on possibilities. So now science is freer from fact. Once you acknowledge fact, you gain freedom from it. And so on the one hand you're realistic, and on the other hand you're idealistic. And that I think captures the essence of modern philosophy. Some modern philosophers are known as empirical, based on fact, like Locke, and others as rational, based on reason, like Descartes. But actually they're together. They're two prongs of the same movement. And that's what Machiavelli got started.
And there were pre-Machiavellians, obviously, who were doubters of the orderliness of nature or of the forms or the ideas or whatever version one wants of this kind of understanding of classes and so forth. But atomists and nominalists and all these different philosophers, I mean, they were real philosophers, I suppose. But they're different from Machiavelli because...
Because why?
Why, yeah. So what does Machiavelli do, or what's the understanding that makes him different from just not just, but from these earlier
So Machiavelli thinks
doubters
that this new respect for fact and possible organization of reason makes possible change. So whereas the pre-Machiavellian philosophers just said, well, this just shows the difficulty of the imperfection of human understanding, the difficulty of understanding things. Philosophy teaches you that we don't know what we think we know. We think it's obvious, but it isn't. Machiavelli, that isn't the lesson that he wants. So the lesson that he draws is that we've underestimated human possibilities up till now. And that's because we've looked on man as under the authority and the sort of dictates of nature. Nature is something eternal. It tells you what is permanent about our situation. But nature has been exaggerated, and a substitution or alternative to nature can be formulated. And so that's what modern, say, rationalism tries to do. So it believes that philosophy has the purpose of changing our world and not just understanding it. For sort of the pre-Machiavellian, pre-modern philosophers, the task of philosophy is to understand the world, and now the new possibility is to change it. That's a very famous statement, not quite exactly in these words by Karl Marx in his thesis on Feuerbach, but it states really the fundamental purpose of modern philosophy. And of course, Marx's changing is, I think, the whole idea of philosophy as the agent of change comes out of Machiavelli. So this is this is philosophy, but it's a new philosophy.
Right.
Yeah. And if it's philosophy, how can there be a new philosophy? That's one question you might say.
Right.
Doesn't it still have to be concerned with eternal things, philosophy? And yet, also you can ask, if philosophy is going to change itself, is this just a temporary sort of a solution? because we face this question of Christianity and its corruption, and if we somehow resolve that and return to a freer and stronger way of living, then can we go back to the old idea of philosophy, instead of just contemplating and not changing the world now having changed. And that's very difficult to see how it isn't a permanent change in philosophy that will be difficult, or if not impossible, to reverse. So, some people wonder about Machiavelli. Was this just a prudent device? Modernity was just something that would be a good thing for a while.
Right.
We don't know quite how long, maybe for quite a long time, but not forever. And that then philosophy, or does philosophy always retain its perhaps fundamentally skeptical attitude even toward modernity? And of course, the history of modernity, as it goes on, is to become more and more critical of itself. So we find that modernity, which begins in this great triumph of reason, of rational control, in the Mandragola is a very good way to see it. Say we can control birth and family and make it do what it's supposed to do through our rational and prudent ways. Or is reason the slave of the passions? That was Hume. Or is reason what kills our creativity and turns us into dead men or last men? That's Nietzsche. So looking at this whole project of modernity, one can wonder whether it doesn't sort of turn on itself and reproduce some of the same questions that Plato and Aristotle might have put to it when Machiavelli began.
On the other hand, I guess if the effectual truth, in fact, has the effects that Machiavelli and that his successors expect, it's a little hard to say that somehow people might dislike it or have an aesthetic distaste for it, or
Yes.
unfortunate side effects
Yes.
that Rousseau and Nietzsche and all these others saw. But
Yeah.
if it is, it is.
Right.
If planes fly and if
Right. What
people
else is there? Yes,
live the
planes
way
fly.
they live,
do.
Machiavelli would say. I guess one could say that.
Yeah.
It's hard to say that it was wrong. He was wrong, right? I mean,
That's right.
somehow.
We're not going to give up our technology or our longer lives. Modern medicine, which was of such great interest to the early modern philosophers, that's what they thought philosophy could do. New philosophies can make us live longer, and that's come about.
Right.
Because the new philosophy is science.
Right.
Philosophy gives birth to modern science, and then science becomes separate from philosophy now. It seems to have its own motion of its own, and it becomes quite critical of philosophy. So science comes out of the rationalism or the conceptualism that is given birth by Machiavelli, and that kind of imagination is, of course, mainly mathematical. So modern science starts out as mathematical physics. That's what Galileo brought, and mathematical is a way of making our life more regular, more rational, less based on prejudice or superstition, and this is perhaps the most interesting thing, less based on common sense. The great enemy of science is common sense. Common sense says that the ordinary person knows better, and that you don't have to go to some fancy college to have common sense, and in fact, it's better not to. So, what is you could say that would be another way to criticize Machiavelli's enterprise. what is the value of common sense still? And what you said, the objection you made, namely that we can't go back, wouldn't that just be common sense and not necessarily a scientific proof?
Right. And it might also be the case that as a practical matter, it's hard to go back. I mean,
Yeah.
people get to like
Yeah.
moderns, the benefits, the fruits of modern science and the benefits of
That's right.
modern economic
Yeah.
growth. I guess was a separate question from, does Machiavelli give people still, though, in his thought, a ground for standing apart from all this that is happening, to judge it and to think about the world?
Yes, right.
Or,
You could
or
say
not.
that.
I mean, that would be isn't
right.
that
Whether
the
you-
self-forgetting
whether-
side
yeah,
of
there is a self-forgetting side. That once you adopt the viewpoint of the world, it's hard to get out of that, and to look at things from the standpoint of the next world, or of the intelligible world. Both of them turn out to be perhaps instrumental to the world. That's how you think of it. That you think that religion will make you better off in this world, and so will your understanding of nature. But on the other hand, you could say that the very word effectual invites disinterested critique, because what is the effect of modernity? Has it really turned out for the better altogether? And one thing that modern science has done is to make it possible for man to destroy mankind, all mankind, with atomic weapons. So if that happens, that will be a kind of refutation, or the possibility of its happening is I think always a question mark. Right, you can't forget, you can't suppress. But besides all the benefits of modern medicine, which many people, including me, have gladly accepted. We could also mention economics.
Yeah.
The triumph of economics, I think, if it is a triumph, again, there's question, is owing to Machiavelli, because economics is based on necessity. And it's the first premise of necessity, what you get in the first course, baby course, or Economics 1 or 101, is that goods are scarce. So you begin from the view that the world, that's the Machiavellian world, is characterized by scarcity. That means that nature isn't there to help you out. So how are you going to get out of this scarcity? Answer: economics. Economics will tell us how to do it freely, but also effectively. So you have to consider not just demand and not just supply, but both. And both, you could say supply is a kind of oligarchical thing. That's what the price that producers want. And demand is democratic. That's what the consumer wants. So that supply and demand give you a kind of mixed regime in which both suppliers and consumers, demanders, are satisfied. And that's what economics promises, a kind of harmony or regularity. Economics thinks that the business cycle can be done away with if you act ahead of time and do what is necessary, you see, to forestall a coming recession. Now, it turns out that economics hasn't really succeeded in doing this. But it does sort of produce a kind of alternation of recession and boom, in which, and this is the way the stock market people look at it, fear and greed operate. So the stock market sometimes goes down when everybody's afraid that you'll lose, and it goes up when everybody gets greedy because you want to gain. So progress is based on this alternation between fear and greed, and fear keeps you from being too greedy, and greed keeps you from being too afraid. So the two kind of counteract each other, even though they're both bad in themselves. That's very Machiavellian.
But the net effect of it, if you, I don't mean, using, I guess, Machiavelli's term effect, but just thinking about it, I mean, I didn't mean it that way, but the consequence of that still is a upward slope. It's like the stock market.
Yes.
When you even out the
Yes. Yeah.
the ups
Yeah.
and downs, you're still
Yeah, you're
more
not-
prosperous
you're
than we're
not-
more prosperous than our grandparents were. So
That's right. That's right. So you're not just
so
level.
That's a vindication, presumably, of
Yeah. Again. Yeah. That's right.
but more of a Machiavellian type of modernity than a
Yeah.
extremely rationally planned,
I
managed to
see.
the detail.
Yes.
I mean, that would be the argument, I suppose.
Yeah.
That when you
Yeah,
really look
that-
at how the modern world works, it has
Yeah.
more.
Yeah. The modern world is not as regular as it tries to give the impression
Or
of
is the,
being. Yes.
right, or the tradition coming out of Hobbes and some of the others.
Yes.
Certainly the 19th century rationalists.
Yeah.
They don't seem to have quite been right that you could manage things as much as they thought.
Yes. Right.
So
yeah.
maybe Machiavelli would have said, well, that's not.
Yes. Yes. You have.
can't, but
Yeah. Yeah. You're. Reason can triumph, but not rationality. You could say, or not rationality in the human soul. So, reason has to manipulate the rationality in the human soul. That's Machiavelli. Also Descartes,
And
the
so Shakespeare-
founder of modern rationalism, was very aware of
Right.
the irrationality of the human soul. So you have to, in a way, you have to nourish your fears and your greed, and feel them. And the way to succeed in the stock market is to be afraid when everyone else is greedy, and greedy when everyone else is afraid. So,
Right.
yeah, but most people can't do that.
Right.
So human rationality depends on human irrationality, you could say, and that's Machiavellian understanding.
Yeah, Machiavelli's modern rationalism seems
Yeah.
seems truer maybe
Yeah.
than the.
But economics is on the whole a great regularizer of necessity. So you don't have to kill people.
Tames.
Yeah.
You
Tames.
just have
It
to
tames
bankrupt
your
them,
yes.
right.
So yeah, it turns your attention from political acquisition to economic, to acquisition of goods, and in other words, your attention to things where there's more of a trade-off. And economic acquisition, there's always a trade-off. That's the whole idea. There's always a price at which an exchange can occur. Whereas in political acquisition, there isn't. There's never a price, really, because if political acquisition ends in war, and war, there's a winner and a loser, and not a trade-off. So so economic acquisition makes life more regular, less exciting, but also less fatal and less sensational, less cruel. Machiavelli believes in a certain basic minimum of cruelty that's necessary. And in economics, you can lose your shirt, but that's all. And then probably someone will take care of you. So modern life, you could say, starts out very tough in Machiavelli. He teaches you to be tough, and in both morals and politics. And it ends soft. We're much softer. We don't believe in capital punishment even. So that's that is a big change in the Machiavellian project. But you could say it happens on Machiavellian grounds.
Could be a sufficient change just to undermine the Machiavellian project if we're too soft to
Yes.
repulse pre-Machiavellian types like believing Muslims who
Yes,
who
believing Muslims,
who value death more
Vladimir
than life.
Putin, or
Yeah. So that's that would be one
people like
criticism,
that,
one question one could raise, I suppose. whether
yes,
the-
it is. Yeah,
And then there's the nuclear war, sort of the flip side question, which is this has been a wonderful project, but if it blows up all the mankind that it was supposed to benefit, that's not whose estate it was supposed to relieve. That's not so great, right?
yeah.
So I guess those.
Yes, so you have to be able to threaten war and even make war, but please not nuclear war.
Right.
Now
You have to be
that's-
strong enough to deal with these
Yeah.
enemies.
That's right, and that's a difficult program, difficult to sustain, and it calls for a kind of Machiavellian prudence, and that means it might not be there. Machiavelli prudent statesmen are not always at the helm, borrowing from the Federalist.
Or it also does the systems which got set up make it harder to, in a way, have such statesmen because they don't see
Yes, that's right.
things
Our
as clearly
education,
as Machiavelli
yeah.
because they're all
Our
in this
education makes you think that everything will be hunky-dory.
happy world of economics and science and progress and
Yes.
so forth. Yeah.
Yeah. So that means we really have to study Machiavelli more than we have been, and more seriously.
Right. And on the philosophic side, I so that would be kind of the political, moral
Yeah.
necessity of studying Machiavelli, if only to keep the Machiavellian project, so to say.
Yeah, and to keep it alive, it needs to be
Alive and
resuscitated
well.
by Machiavelli.
Yeah.
Yes, that's very true.
And then on the
And then
philosophic side,
the philosophers need to look more closely at the foundations of modern philosophy.
and I guess the
and,
question one could raise is common sense seems not to quite go away despite the
Yeah.
efforts to overcome it, and aren't trees still, isn't there something intelligible about saying, or
Yes.
compelling even about
Yes,
saying
right.
that there are
And
these, seem to be these kind of forms and genuses and
right.
species?
And nature has some regularity. Isn't it somehow comforting that we have this different seasons and so
Right.
on? That gives you kind of pleasure, a certain variety that, in your life. So and we see, of course, many political movements coming back to nature, environmentalism. So that suggests that maybe science goes too far or can go too far. Of course, we think that there are scientific solutions for science going too far.
Right.
But so we don't want to throw away science, and we also don't want to question it very severely. But yes, we need to reread Machiavelli and also the pre-Machiavellians, let's say Plato and Aristotle, Xenophon, other ancient writers whom Machiavelli opposed.
And on that note, a very ambitious assignment for everyone to take from this conversation. Well, really, thank you very much. This has been fascinating. So thank you, Harvey Mansfield, and thank you for joining us on Conversations.